I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're confronting ocean tipping points in one of our case studies, Gwaii Haanas, which many of you may not know where that is. Gwaii Haanas, which means Islands of Beauty, is here on the southern end of Haida Gwaii, which means Islands of the People. And Haida Gwaii is situated off the northern coast of British Columbia. It's an archipelago, and it's been occupied by the Haida First Nation for, I think it's about 14,000 years now. So it's been a place that's had human inhabitants for thousands and thousands of years. And so it makes for a really interesting case study, in part just because of that. But in addition, Gwaii Haanas is a national park reserve, national marine conservation area, and Haida heritage site. It's been protected now since the 1970s, and more recently in the 1990s, the National Marine Conservation Area was put into place. And it's managed in a really interesting way in that the First Nation, the Haida First Nation, the Council of the Haida Nation, and the federal government, Parks Canada and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, have come together in a co-management fashion to jointly manage this area. And so they manage that under a body called the Archipelago Management Board. And then, as Carrie said, our opportunity to work here is sort of twofold in that, first of all, this management body is developing a management plan for Gwaii Haanas, but also there's some really interesting ecosystem dynamics with some real political consequences that are happening for the people of Haida Gwaii, and actually across all of British Columbia and even down here across the Pacific coast, that's centered on this little guy here. This is Pacific herring. It's one of the forage fish species, and it really forms the basis for the food chain for many pelagic ecosystems across the Pacific, and I just want to show you what I mean here. It's a bit dramatic. Ah! You think that little bird got eaten? No! So sad. So obviously, these forage fish species are so named in part because they form the basis for the food chain in many systems around the world, and herring in particular on the Pacific coast. And they're also very important for people. So they lay their eggs near shore on substrates like kelp, and that in itself is a very important subsistence harvest target for the Haida First Nations and many First Nations across British Columbia. And it's also a commercial resource. It's harvested and shipped primarily to China as roe on kelp, and it's considered a real delicacy. And good. In addition to the commercial roe on kelp fishery and the subsistence fishery, it's also targeted by a commercial seine fishery for the roe as well, but the adults are taken and the eggs are removed from those adults, and then the adult bodies are turned into fertilizer. So as you can see, it's a really important resource for people. But herring have crossed a tipping point. So in the 1960s, there was a major crash of the herring fishery. It eventually saw a recovery, but more recently in the 2000s, it saw another crash and actually has been slow to recover again. And this has led to fisheries closures for the roe on kelp, for the roe fishery, as well as lower harvests for the roe on kelp fishery. So it's been a real challenge for British Columbians and for Haida people in particular. But you'll notice these sort of two dots that are starting to kind of move above that line. And what that's led to is this, because there's this hard cap on the biomass of herring when they close the fishery, as soon as it kind of peaks above that line, DFO opens the fishery. And that has led to some pretty major controversy in Haida Gwaii and across British Columbia. So in 2013, the Fisheries and Oceans Canada opened formerly closed areas across British Columbia and Haida Gwaii, Vancouver Island, and the Central Coast to commercial roe fishing. And this led to a protest by local First Nations. The First Nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Nuu-Chah-Nulth, and Haida and the Central Coast Heiltsuk Nations came together and actually went to court to try to close the fishery. In February, the court granted an injunction to the Nuu-Chah-Nulth First Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island and closed the fishery, but the other fisheries remained open. So while this injunction was happening on the west coast, the Central Coast and Haida Nations had to come to the fishermen themselves and basically ask for them to not fish. And it actually led to some pretty high stakes protests on the water with people's lives at stake. And so it was a really big legal battle and a really big battle on the water that was very costly to people, both emotionally as well as financially. And so there's this continued sense that DFO assessments, these stock assessments that they're doing, are really not working, and they're not taking an ecosystem perspective, and there isn't a sense that there's going to be this thoughtfulness around how you're setting those recovery targets and when it's okay to open the fishery. In addition, these collapses, if they continue to happen, not only are they important for people and their livelihoods, but also costly when they occur, is that they matter to dependent predators. I mean, humpback whales and birds being major predators of herring, and really they do form that important part of the system. And humpback whales are actually starting to recover in these waters. And so how can we continue to see recovery of humpbacks if we don't continue to see recovery of their major prey resources? And one really interesting paper that kind of illustrates this beyond video evidence is this work that was done by Curry et al. In 2011, published in Science, where they looked at a synthesis, a meta-analysis of seabirds across the globe and identified what level of forage fish biomass is really important for reproductive success of seabirds. And what they found is that consistently there was this kind of inflection point that was happening across all of those ecosystem types. That's normalized, but basically it's 1/3 of the virgin stock, estimated virgin biomass of forage fish that would be necessary to really maintain successful breeding for seabirds. So we've been taking all of this political opportunity as well as some of this scientific information into consideration and working with our management body, the Archipelago Management Board, as well as some of the other scientists and managers across the region, to think about how we can start to avoid these tipping points and work with people to meet their needs, meet the needs of the herring, the people, and the dependent predators. So we've been thinking about this in the context of these different types of fishing activities in particular, because that was something of interest to particularly the Council of Haida Nation, was how do we show that our row-on kelp fishing has less of an impact than the roe fishery, and how can we show how the roe fishery is having an impact, and what is the safe operating space for these different fishery types. And so to do that, some of our colleagues at NOAA did an age-based stochastic age structure model where they looked at basically harvest rates for the roe-on kelp, the eggs of herring, and they looked at the probability of fishery closure with different rates of egg harvest. And then they also looked at the harvest rate for different harvest rates for the adult fishery. And what this shows is as you increase the proportion of egg harvest, you don't get much the probability of fishery closure, and that's based on a 25% probability that the fishery would close based on these closure targets, these hard caps. And basically what we see is that it really takes a lot of egg fishing to close the fishery. But that if you start to harvest the adults, you start to see that creep up, and so increasing harvest of adult herring is a big deal. Okay, that's not rocket science, right? You take out the adults, the fish that produce the eggs, you're likely to have a big impact. But it is interesting, though, how much more the adult harvest really affects the probability of fishery closure than the changes in the egg harvest. So we've been working with taking this model and integrating that idea of 1/3 for the birds and thinking, okay, how do we translate this into safe operating space for the Haida fishery? And so what this does is it basically shows areas where, and this is based on an estimated virgin biomass, so unfished biomass of herring at 24,000 metric tons. Assuming 1/3 of that would be available for birds, that's 8,000 metric tons. So anything in this pink area is where you've met the criterion of 8,000 metric tons, and the probability of fishery closure as less than 25% of likely that it's going to close. And then this area is where you only are finding it safe for birds, but that you don't meet that other criterion. And the blue is it's safe for birds and not fishing. Sorry, vice versa. Safe for fishing but not birds. Safe for birds but not fishing. So you can identify these areas and these harvest rates that might be putting you in a place where you can actually meet the needs of the different stakeholders while also meeting the needs of the ecosystem. So we've also been working with some folks at UC Santa Barbara to translate this model into a decision tool which allows people to unpack the modeling that's been behind that safe operating space figure and really play with it themselves. What are some of the parameters? Because you're making a lot of assumptions in a model you make, right? How do those actually change these dynamics, and what are some of the outcomes that happen so that they can get their heads around it and really understand it, so that when they come to the table and starting to negotiate for some of these needs, they have a better understanding of what the model can do and what it can't. So that's sort of where we are at this point. We're really working to understand how these different harvest strategies have different consequences, and we're beginning to develop these models and tools to really understand these trade-offs. Our next step is really understanding this in a spatial framework and thinking about how Haida people in particular access these areas for subsistence roe on kelp, and how the commercial fishery operates in a spatial context, to really understand how you could operationalize these concepts in a spatial way. So it's a pretty exciting project. There's a lot more going on up there that I can talk to you about later if you have more questions, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.